Welcome back everyone, I'm Nick. This channel is Swiftful Thinking, where we cover all things Swift and SwiftUI related. And I hope you guys are getting used to publishers and subscribers by now, because we have covered them in the past two videos if you're following along. And although we covered them, we didn't get into creating our own custom publishers and subscribers yet. That's what we're going to do in this video. So we're going to start out very simply by actually creating a timer, which we did in the last video, except in the last video we did it in the view. And in this video we're going to create a view model and put our own custom timer in the view model and have the view, of course, update with that timer. We're then, of course, going to take it to the next level, and we're going to create some really custom publishers and subscribers that are going to be super useful when you guys make your applications. I think by the end of this video you're going to really start to see just how powerful this Combine framework is and why we love publishers and subscribers, because by using these efficiently we can keep all of the data in sync in our apps, and this is definitely the future of iOS development. So while we're talking about subscribers in this video, I do want to also remind you guys to hit that subscribe button if you have not already, to stay up to date with all of my content. Alright, thank you guys for watching. Let's jump into Xcode and take a look.
Alright, welcome back everyone. I am back in our Xcode project, of course, and if you were with me in the last video, we set up a timer, which was actually a publisher, and then we used this modifier called onReceive, in which we listened to the timer when it published values, and then we ran functions. And in this video, we're basically doing the same kind of thing, except instead of using this onReceive in the view, we're going to do this in a view model, and we're going to make our own custom subscribers. Alright, so let's right click the navigator, create a new file. It's going to be a SwiftUI view, and let's call this Subscriber Bootcamp. Go ahead and click Create. Let's click Resume on the canvas. Alright, and we're going to start by just setting up a timer like we did in the last video, except we're going to put it into a view model because the logic is a little bit different. So I think starting with this timer will make it easy to understand what we're doing. So let's create a class. Let's call it Subscriber View Model. It will conform to observable object because we want to observe it from the view. And while we're here, let's initialize a new one with an @state object. var, let's call it VM for view model, and we'll set it equal to a subscriber view model. Let's create a very simple publisher. So every time we use an @published, I've been using this like across this course and even in the last course, this @published is setting up a publisher. So anything with this @published is going to publish values over time. So we're going to create an @published var count, and it'll be of type int, and we'll set it equal to 0. We're going to put this count onto the screen real simply. Let's create a vstack, open the brackets. Let's put this text inside, and in here we're just going to use the \, open close parentheses, and we'll reference the vm.count. Click resume on the canvas and we should see it now. Let's make it a little bigger. Let's give it a font of .large title. And we have our 0 on the screen. And now let's set up our timer. And in the last video, I made the timer in the view, but now we're going to put it into the view model. So let's create a func. Let's call it setup timer. Open close parentheses, open the brackets. And the logic for the timer is actually very similar to what we had in the last video. We're going to say timer, then we're going to call publish on. And here we can add our every how many seconds we want to publish. And because we're going to have a couple modifiers here, I'm going to put this on a separate line. So we're going to create a timer. We're going to publish. Let's publish every 1 second. Let's run it on the main loop. And let's just make this .common. And now that we have a timer, we actually want to start it by calling .autoconnect. And then in the last video, we used the onReceive call, which is what we can use in a view, but we can't use the onReceive call inside the view model. So instead, what we use is something called .sync. And if you were with me 2 videos back when we downloaded data from the internet with Combine, we used this sync already. Now, when we used it a couple of videos back and we were downloading from the data, we used this sync completion where we get a value for the receive completion, and that will tell us if there was an error or if it was successful. But when we're setting up this timer, we know that it's going to publish every 1 second. There is no chance that the data from this timer is wrong. So because of that, I'm not going to use this completion, and I'm just going to use this first sync value, sync receive value. And we can click enter on the completion here, and this will be the value that is being published through this timer. So in the last video, we saw that the value from a timer is actually a date. And if we wanted to put that date on the screen, we could use this value. But we are just going to update this count, so we don't need the received value. So I'm just going to put an underscore here. And I think because we're using an underscore, we can actually get rid of these parentheses as well. And now we need some code, what we want to do when we get this timer. So very simply, I'm just going to call count plus equals 1. We're going to get the error that count needs a reference to self, which we can fix. But of course, we like to use weak references when we're in a view model, so we're going to use the weak self. If you are confused with weak self, I did a video on it about 5 or 10 videos ago, so go check that out and then come on back. But by adding this, self now becomes a weak reference and is basically optional. And finally, we get this message that the result of call sync is unused. And basically what that means when we're talking about these publishers is we need to store it somewhere so that we can cancel it later. And I covered this again 2 videos back when we downloaded from the internet, but basically we need to store this timer somewhere. So I'm going to create up here, we're going to say var, I'll call it timer, and this will be of type any cancelable. And we actually don't have that yet because we did not yet import combine. And now this will be of type any cancelable. And basically what that means is any object that is cancelable can be in here. So it doesn't have to be a timer. But of course it can be a timer, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to set any cancelable, and we're going to make it optional to begin with. So there's a chance that there is no timer. But when we call setup timer, we're actually going to set timer equal to this timer. And now our errors go away and we have this timer. So now all we need to do is on our init, I'm going to call setup timer. And hopefully if I rerun the app, we get our timer publishing and it's going up every second. Let's click play on the canvas here and beautiful. Every 1 second, our timer is going up. So this is the very simple basics of what we're getting into. We create a publisher. And then here we are actually subscribing to the publisher. We're listening to the published values and then doing something with it on the screen. And just to point out here, this cancelable, because it's cancelable, we can cancel it at any time. So for example, if in this sync I wanted to cancel this timer after it gets to 10, we can say, so here we can say if let count equals self.count. And we have to do this if let because self is optional. So if self is nil, obviously this will fail. And then we'll also say if the count, which is referring to this count, is greater than or equal to 10. So if it's greater than 10, let's just call self.timer.cancel. All right, so if I press play one more time, it should now go up to 10. But after we get to 10, it should cancel. So the timer will stop. We can see at 10 that it does stop, and that's basically all this any cancelable is. It is something that we can cancel at any time. And I do want to point out here that because this self question mark is optional, and we use it a whole bunch of times here, most professional developers would first do a check to make sure that self is actually valid. Because if self is valid, chances are we don't need to do anything in this entire closure. So here we could actually do guard let self equals self else return. So I know it looks weird, but basically we are checking that self is valid. So if we can set a new variable called self equal to the weak variable self, so this weak self, then we can keep going with this function. And because it is strong, we no longer need these question marks. We can get rid of this. And this self.count is actually valid. So we don't even need this let statement here. We can just do self.count and then self.timer. And now our screen is working again. Just a little bit better code. All right, one other thing I want to point out while we're here and keeping it simple is that this timer is perfect if we had one publisher. But if we had a bunch of publishers, more often, instead of creating one variable like this, we would create a var, and I'll call it cancellables. So anything that can be cancelable, I'll put in here. And I'll set it equal to a set that takes type any cancelable. And we'll open and close the parentheses to set this up. So this is a set, which is basically an array that can't have duplicates. And then we can store our publishers into this set. So instead of setting timer equal to timer here, we can actually just call .store in, and we're looking for the set completion. Here I'll put in cancellables. Now I can get rid of the timer here. It works the exact same way, but now we have these cancellables. And if I wanted to maybe cancel everything in this cancellables, we could then do something like this, where we could say for item in cancellables, item.cancel. So we can cancel a bunch of things at once if we need to. We need self dot here. Try again. It should still work. And I use this set any cancellables a couple videos back. Again, it is just storing a place because the publishers can be canceled at any time. And we got to 10 and then it canceled. All right. We need to get rid of this cancel code here so that the timer keeps going up. I'm going to stop the preview real quick. And now we're going to do a real world example that I use all the time in my apps that I think will really start to explain how we can use publishers that are not timers, because so far timers are so easy to understand, but there's other things that we can do as well. So let's create an @published var. We'll call this text field text of type string, and we'll set it equal to a blank string. All right, now this of course is going to be text for a text field, so let's set that up in our view. Underneath this text, we'll put a text field. I'm going to set the title and binding text here. So the title will say type something here, ... This is the placeholder, sorry. And then the text we're going to bind to the viewModel.textFieldText. To make it look a little better, so let's give it a .frame with a height of 55. Let's give it a background color of color. Let's do a color literal, and I like to use this second Mercury crayon here. I think it looks good on text fields. Let's give it a corner radius of 10. Let's give it a font of headline while we're here. Let's click resume on the canvas to see what it looks like. On the VStack, let's just add some padding quick. And I like to do a little indent. So before these frames, let's add padding .leading. .leading. So we have a very simple text here, but it is binding to the text field text. So let's click play on it, and when I type, we can just ignore the counter for now, but when I type, every time I type a letter here, it is actually updating this text field text. And if I look, this text field text is referencing the view model, which is our view model here, .text field text. So if I scroll up, we have this text field text, and this text field text is @published, so it is a publisher. So basically every time this gets updated, it is publishing a new value. Just like the timer, every 1 second it gets updated and it publishes a new value, and then we can run functions every 1 second. Now we can do the same thing every time this gets updated. Now it's not going to be every second, it's going to be every time someone types on the text field, but every time this gets updated, we can listen to it, we can subscribe to it, and then perform actions. So I'm going to create another function, and let's do it up here. Let's call it func. Let's call it add text field subscriber. Open close parentheses, open the brackets. And here we're going to listen to this text field text and then make some other decisions in our app. So to listen to this, all we need to do is add the money sign and then text field text. And when we look at this description here, we can see that it is .publisher at the end. So this is publishing values. So we click that. And for simplicity's sake, let's create another variable called @published var, and let's call this text is valid. And this will be of type bool, and we'll set it equal to false. And basically every time this text field text gets updated, we're going to run some logic to check if that text is valid. And if it's valid, we'll update this to true. If it's not, obviously it'll be false. So what we're going to do here, when this receives a value, we're going to call .map. And we're going to look for the transform here where we have a string. And this again is why a couple videos back I covered how to deal with data in terms of maps, filters, and sorts. So go check out that video if you don't know what map is. Basically, we are transforming a string into T, which is basically any type that we want to transform it into. So I'll click enter here, and this will be the text. So every time this text field text gets updated, and that's going to be with the text in the field, this text is what we're going to be receiving from the publisher. So then we want to convert this text to a bool to determine whether or not this is valid. So we'll say return bool here. And we're going to do a very simple check. We're going to say if text.count is greater than 3, return true. So if it's at least 3 characters long, we'll return true, and otherwise we will return false. All right, so now we have a Boolean, and all we need to do is set this text is valid. So I'm going to call .assign, and we're going to use the to and on completion here. So down here we used sync, and now we're using assign, and it's another way to just set the value, but I'm going to go over the difference in a second. But basically we're going to take this bool, we're going to use the backslash dot, and we're going to look for this text is valid, and it will be on self. All right, so every time we get this Boolean, it's going to assign the value to text is valid. And then finally, we will just store this in our cancellables set, just like before. And for simplicity's sake, let's just add one more text here. On the screen, we'll add a text. This will be, we'll call vm.textisvalid.description. Let's just put it here for a second so we can see that it is false. All right, and then all we need to do is actually call this add text field subscriber from our init, add text field subscriber, and let's click resume. All right, and every time I type something into this text field now, it's going to update this publisher variable, this text field text. And here we are subscribing to that publisher. So every time I type something, something will get published down here, and this function is going to run. It's going to check if that text that I typed in has at least 3 characters. If it's greater than 3, this will be true, otherwise it will be false. We're going to take that value, put it into text is valid, and that's what we see on the screen as false. So if I type 1 letter, it's false, 2 letters, 3 letters, and when I get to 4, it is now greater than 3, so this returned true, and we're assigning the value to text is valid, and that's why this updated to true. So this is all great, but I want to point out here that when we set up the timer, we used the sync call. And the benefit here of using the sync call is that we can make self weak. So again, I covered this because it is so important. And when we use this assign, unfortunately, there is no way, at least right now, to make self weak. So while it's obviously working, we're trying to be professional developers here, so I actually cannot recommend using the assign, but rather using the sync whenever you can. And we're just going to use the receive value here. I'm going to press enter, and this will be the is valid. This will be whether or not this is true or false. And of course, we'll set self.text is valid equal to is valid. Finally, we'll make this weak self, make this optional, and now we have much better code. And of course it still works. If I type 4 letters in, we are at true. Now the reason I'm doing this for this text field is because this is a very real use case, because when people type in the text field, a lot of times you want to make sure if they're making a username or they're making a password that it is at least so many characters long. Maybe you want to make sure that it doesn't have curse words, and you can do all of that logic in here. So as if this was a real app, I'm going to go down and take our text, take our Boolean of true or false off the screen. And instead on this text field, I'm going to add a dot overlay. I'm going to add a Z stack, open the brackets. In the Z stack, I'm going to add an image with a system name of X mark. Let's give it a foreground color of red. And I'm going to make the whole Z stack with a font of headline. And we can see the X in the center here. Let's move it to the right side. So on the overlay, we can actually add a comma at alignment. Let's make it dot trailing. And then let's give it some padding trailing as well. So it's pushed in a little bit. Let's add one more image here. We'll use the system name. This will be checkmark. You probably know where I'm going with this. This will be foreground color of green. Let's make it a little bit bigger by giving it a font of title. And now all we're going to do is basically show these whether or not the text field is valid. So on this X mark, we're going to say dot opacity. And here the X mark, we only want to show the X mark if the text field is not valid. So here we'll say vm.text is valid. And if it's valid, this will be 0, otherwise 1.0. And then on the check mark, we're going to say .opacity, vm.text is valid. If it's valid, 1.0, otherwise 0.0. And I also want to add one that if there is no text, if this is 0, I don't even want to show the X here. So let's actually update this to say, first say vm.text field text.count is less than 1. So if it's less than 1, we'll do 0. Otherwise, we'll check if it's valid. Alright, and now we have our text field here, and this could be like a real app. So I'm typing, I have my name, which I'll just type in NI, and I need it to be at least 3 characters long. That's the rule we set in our app. And once I get to 4 characters, we now have that check mark. And if we go back down, it goes back to X. If I go over 4 letters, it's back to a check. So this is awesome. One quick tip I want to show you guys is that when we have these subscribers, we can actually also call something called .debounce. We're going to use this for and scheduler. And the for is just an amount of time. So we're going to call .seconds, and we'll call 0.5. And for the schedule, we're just going to put this on the dispatch queue.main. And debounce is very commonly used when dealing with text fields, especially with searching. And essentially what happens is when users are typing in a text field, they're usually typing pretty quick, so like a whole bunch of times. And every time they type a letter, this map function is going to run. So right now, this is obviously very simple logic, but if you had a lot of logic, or if this logic was like going to a database or doing some advanced filtering, that would be a lot of functionality that you're forcing your app to run every single letter. So we can add a debounce. So if I'm typing really quickly, it will basically wait until I'm done typing for at least 0.5 seconds before running all of this code. So in this text field right now, if I type really quickly, and I keep typing, you'll see that I'm above 4 characters, and yet it still says X. But once I stop for 0.5 seconds, it'll run that code, and we can see that it turned into a check mark here. Similarly, if I'm deleting the text, so every time I delete a letter, this text field text is getting published, but it's not going to be until I stop for 0.5 seconds that it actually updates. So when you're using a text field, this debounce comes in handy, especially if you're using a search where you have some advanced functionality in here. And the last thing I want to show you guys quick is that we can subscribe to multiple publishers and combine them together to get a really advanced in our applications. So first, let's create an @published var. We'll say show button of type bool, and we'll set it equal to false. And we're just going to show a button on our screen. So down here on our view, I'm going to zoom out here a little bit. Underneath the text field, I'll just add a button open the parentheses. Let's give it the action and label, although we're not going to add any functionality into the action. The text is just going to say maybe submit. We'll call it uppercase. Let's give it a font of headline. Let's give it a foreground color of white. Let's give it a background color of color dot blue. Let's give it a corner radius of 10. And before the background, let's add a frame with a height of 55 and a frame with a max width of infinity. Click resume on the canvas to see it quickly. We have a very simple submit button, and I'm going to add .opacity, and we'll say vm.showButton. So if we want a show button, we'll make it 1.0. If show button is false, we'll make it 0.5. So it's kind of like grayed out like this. And then finally on the button, we're just going to call .disabled. And here we're going to call not with the exclamation point, and we'll call vm.showButton. So if it's not show button, we can't even click on this submit. But once we update show button, we obviously can click submit. So if I try to click it right now, it doesn't highlight. I can't actually click it. All right. And now, obviously, we're going to add some logic on when we want to update show button to true. So going back up, I'm going to quickly fold up these functions. Again, that's Command Option left arrow. And let's add one more. Let's call it func add button subscriber. Open close parentheses, open the brackets. Let's add that in our init. And this time we're going to subscribe to the text is valid. So we're going to say money sign text is valid. So every time text is valid gets changed, we're going to get a published value here. Then we're going to also add .combine latest. And then we're going to add another publisher. And for our sake, we're just going to use this count publisher that we made at the beginning of the video. So here we'll do money sign count. So now we're listening to the text is valid publisher as well as the count publisher. And then we're going to call .sync like we've been doing. And I'm going to press enter on this value here, and we can see that there's actually two values I'm getting in the sync. I'm getting a Boolean, which we can see right here, and that Boolean is the text is valid, right? Because that's a bool. And then I'm also getting an int here, and that's coming from our count publisher, which is obviously an int. So here I'm going to say is valid, comma, and count. So here what we're doing is listening to two different publishers, and we're getting the most recent published value from both of them. So is valid will be true or false, and count will be obviously a number. And then we're just going to check if it's valid and the count is greater than 10, we'll show the button. So like good coders, we're first going to add weak self in here. And then we're going to say guard let self equals self, else return. Return. All right, and now in this code, let's say if this new published value is true. So we're going to say, let's say if is valid, and that's this new published value. So if it published as true, and this new published count, so count is greater than or equal to 10. So if it's valid, so if the text is valid and the count is greater than 10, we're going to say self.showButton equals true. We'll say else self.showButton equals false. Finally, we need to store it in our cancellables. Now that error should go away. And click resume here. Now we're adding a really complex subscriber here. So if the text is valid and the count is greater than 10. So if I start typing here, the text is not valid. Obviously, it's still an X. If I go to 4 letters, though, we can see that the text is now valid. And since the count is greater than 10, the submit button now becomes highlightable. And the big takeaway I want you guys to have from this video is that we can create these published variables. And these published variables don't have to be text field text. They don't have to be Booleans. They can be pretty much any variable. And anytime you update that published variable, it's going to publish some data. And since it's a publisher, we can subscribe to that data. So down here, we're subscribing to text field text, where we learned debounce. We are syncing that text into something else on our app. In our setup timer, we are creating a publisher right here, and then we're also subscribing and listening to it here. And then down here in our add button subscriber, we are subscribing to the text is valid publisher, and we're also subscribing to the count publisher. So we're combining two publishers here, and then we're doing something in our app. So bottom line, you can create publishers that are going to publish values, and then you can subscribe and listen to publishers. And when you listen to publishers, you can update your UI, run functions in your application. So I know it's a lot to take in, but this is very important because this is the future of iOS development. Publishers and subscribers are your friends because they're actually saving us so much logic in our app, because we no longer have to manually update things. Instead, we can just subscribe to changes and our view will always stay in sync because everything is listening and subscribing to each other. And if this is still super confusing to you guys, I would first recommend trying to make your own publishers and subscribers and seeing if you can figure it out on your own. In my next playlist, we are going to make an app and use Combine all over it. So we are going to become experts at these publishers and subscribers, and it's going to be awesome. I'm super excited to share it with you guys. All right. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.